Ever wondered what happens when a town simply dies, yet its shadows refuse to leave? I've walked the ruins of America's creepiest towns, and I'm not just talking about legends. I'm sharing the raw, chilling reality that most cameras miss. Stay until the end, you aren't ready for what we found. Subscribe to join our journey into the unknown, you don't want to miss the dark stories we're digging up next. 1 Story Centralia, Pennsylvania. We pulled our old van off the main highway and onto the gravel road that led into Centralia, Pennsylvania, and the moment the engine died, the silence hit us like a physical weight. There were 8 of us in total, me, my wife, our 4 kids, my brother, and our sister. My parents were in the passenger seat, staring out at the cracked, weed-choked asphalt that used to be a town. We had heard the stories about the coal mine fire burning beneath our feet for decades, but nothing prepares you for the reality of standing where a civilization simply vanished. The air smelled strange, a metallic, sulfurous scent that seemed to rise directly from the earth, and as we stepped out, the ground felt unnervingly warm under our boots. My father, who usually has a joke for everything, just gripped his cane tighter, his eyes scanning the horizon where the smoke was curling up through the vents in the ground. We started walking down what used to be a main street, but there were no houses, no shops, just empty lots marked by overgrown grass and the occasional lonely tree. The kids were quiet, their usual laughter replaced by a strange, wide-eyed tension. I noticed my sister stop suddenly, pointing toward a distant patch of woods where the fog was thickest. She whispered that she heard a humming sound, like a deep, mechanical growl echoing from deep inside the belly of the earth. We all froze, listening. It wasn't the wind, it was rhythmic, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to vibrate in our very bones. My wife grabbed the kids' hands, her knuckles turning white, and we all felt that sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that tells you aren't alone, even when the world looks completely abandoned. As we reached a cluster of vents, the intensity of the heat increased. One of my children started crying, claiming they saw someone standing near the tree line, watching us with dark, hollow eyes. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the trick of the light and the shifting steam, but when I looked back, I saw it too, a silhouette, perfectly still, standing amidst the thick, gray smoke. It wasn't a trick, it was a figure, shaped like a man in old-fashioned work clothes, but his outline seemed to blur and shudder as if he were part of the fire itself. My brother tried to call out, but his voice died in his throat, and the temperature around us plummeted, despite the heat rising from the ground. It was a cold that bit through our jackets, a sharp, biting chill that felt like a warning to turn back. We moved faster, trying to get back to the van, but the road seemed to stretch and twist in ways that didn't make sense. Every path we took led us right back to the same crumbling street corner. My mother began to pray under her breath, and my father's face was deathly pale. We weren't just lost, we were being toyed with. The humming sound grew louder, turning into a screeching metallic grind, and the smoke began to swirl around us in thick, suffocating clouds. It felt like the ground was heaving, trying to remind us that we were intruders in a place that the living were never meant to reclaim. I remember the weight of the air, thick with the history of the families who were forced to leave, their memories clinging to the charred soil like shadows that refused to fade. Finally, we saw the glint of our van's windshield in the distance, and we didn't look back until we were inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. Even as I floored the gas, none of us spoke. We felt the sensation of being watched.
Until we were miles away, back on the highway where the world felt normal again. My kids slept in the back, but they whimpered in their dreams, and my wife just stared out the window at the darkening sky. We never told anyone exactly what we saw that day in the smoke, because how do you explain that for a few hours, we were walking through a doorway to somewhere else? That place isn't just a town destroyed by fire, it's a living, breathing scar on the earth, and I know with every fiber of my being, that whatever was left behind in those ruins is still waiting for the next group of travelers to wander too far off the road. 2-Story Bodie, California. We pulled our dusty SUV into the driveway of the old Victorian house in Bodie, California, and for a moment, the sheer isolation of the place took my breath away. It was supposed to be a dream project, a chance to renovate a piece of history, to breathe new life into a structure that had stood silent for over a century. My wife, our young daughter, and I stepped out, stretching our legs after the long drive, while our golden retriever puppy Buster jumped out of the back seat, tail wagging with excitement. But as soon as Buster's paws hit the dirt near the porch, he stopped dead. He didn't just hesitate, he tucked his tail between his legs, let out a low whimpering whine, and backed away, staring at the front door with his hackles raised as if he were looking at a wall of fire. I laughed it off, thinking he was just spooked by the unfamiliar scent of sagebrush and old wood. But as we walked toward the door, he dug his heels into the dirt and refused to move forward. My daughter tried to pull his leash gently, but he let out a sharp, frightened bark that echoed strangely against the surrounding hills, sounding more like a warning than a playful noise. My wife and I exchanged a worried glance, but we were tired and determined to settle in before the sun dipped behind the Sierra Nevada peaks. I finally had to pick him up, his little body trembling violently against my chest, and the second I crossed the threshold into the house, I felt an abrupt drop in temperature that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a draft. It was an icy heavy sensation that seemed to settle deep into my lungs. Inside, the house was frozen in time, filled with antique furniture that felt far too heavy for the floorboards. That first night was when the real fear began to seep in. As I was trying to set up our bedroom, I heard a rhythmic tapping coming from the hallway, just like someone tapping their fingers on wood. I assumed it was the house settling, but when I looked down at Buster, he was sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and unblinking, tracking something that was moving across the ceiling. He began to growl, a deep guttural sound that didn't belong in such a small dog, his head following a path that started at the closet door and slowly moved toward our bed. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, and when I looked at my wife, she was clutching the blanket, her face pale, whispering that she felt like the air in the room had become too thick to breathe. We tried to dismiss it, telling ourselves it was just the stress of the move, but the house had its own rhythm, and it wasn't one of peace. The following afternoon, I was in the kitchen when I heard my daughter laughing in the living room, but when I walked in, she was sitting alone on the rug with her back to me, talking to someone. Buster was cowering under the sofa, whimpering so hard his body was shaking, and when I asked her who she was talking to, she turned around with a confused look and said that the sad man in the gray coat told her we shouldn't have moved his furniture. The temperature in the room surged, becoming stiflingly hot, and I felt a sudden sharp pressure on my shoulder, like a hand pushing me back. I grabbed my daughter and backed out of the room, my legs feeling like lead as the heavy scent of ozone and rot filled the air. That night, the house seemed to wake up completely. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking down the hallway, dragging something metallic across the floorboards. My wife and I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening to the sounds of a life that clearly hadn't left this place. Buster was howling now, a high-pitched mourning sound that curdled my blood, and he refused to come near the bedroom door, keeping his eyes fixed on the darkness of the hall. I gathered the courage to turn on the lamp, but the light flickered and died, leaving us in a darkness so absolute it felt like we were underwater. Then I heard it, a voice thin and raspy, whispering my own name from the foot of the bed. It wasn't a trick of the mind, it was a cold, deliberate sound that vibrated right against my ear. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed our essential bags, scooped up a terrified Buster, and ran out the front door, the screen slamming behind us with a violence that sounded like a gunshot. We scrambled into the car, not stopping until we hit the main highway miles away, the lights of the distant town acting as our only lifeline. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can still feel that icy pressure on my shoulder and hear that whisper in the dark, reminding me that some places aren't meant for the living. We left most of our belongings behind, and honestly, I wouldn't go back for them if you paid me. You can try to explain it away with logic, but when you see a place that even a dog is terrified to step into, you realize that some boundaries were meant to be left alone, and we were lucky to get out with our lives. 3. Story St. Elmo, Colorado. We drove our truck up the winding narrow path towards St. Elmo, Colorado, and the higher we climbed, the more the air seemed to lose its warmth, replaced by a biting mountain chill that settled deep in our lungs. It was supposed to be our peaceful getaway, me, my wife, our young son, and our pet monkey Mojo, who was usually the life of every trip we took. As the old wooden storefronts of the long-abandoned mining town came into view, the silence of the valley was so profound it felt heavy, like a pressure building up against our eardrums. We pulled into the small dusty plot next to the cabin we had rented for the week, but the moment the engine cut, Mojo let out a sharp, erratic chattering sound and scrambled as far away from the cabin door as his leash would allow. He didn't just refuse to go inside, he stood by the front tire of the truck, his tail tucked tight, his eyes wide and fixed on the front porch with a look of pure, instinctive terror that I had never seen before. I tried to coax him in with his favorite treats, but he wouldn't budge, shivering so violently that the small bell on his collar rattled against the quiet of the mountains. My wife and I shared a look of confusion, but we were too tired to argue with an animal, so we left him near the truck and stepped into the cabin ourselves. The interior was like stepping back into the late 1800s, smelling strongly of aged pine and a faint, lingering scent of lavender that felt completely out of place in such a rugged environment. As we started unpacking, the floorboards groaned under our feet with a rhythmic, heavy sound, almost as if someone was walking just a few paces behind us, matching our every step. My son, usually fearless, clung to my wife's leg, whispering that the lady in the long dress was standing in the corner of the room, looking at him with eyes that didn't have any light in them. That first night, the temperature dropped so low we could see our breath, even with the fireplace roaring, and the atmosphere in the cabin grew thick and suffocating. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something dragging along the roof, a slow metallic scrape that echoed down through the rafters. I nudged my wife.
The only sound the ragged, terrified breathing of the four of us, and none of us dared to look back until we were miles away, back under the safety of the main highway lights. Even now, weeks later, the memory of that woman's gaze and the way Mojo refused to step foot in that town keeps me awake at night. I know what people say about ghost towns. They talk about history and old miners and gold, but they don't talk about the things that stay behind to guard the silence. That place isn't just a collection of old buildings, it's a living, breathing trap, a doorway to a past that doesn't want to be forgotten. Every time I think about that cabin, I can still smell that faint, lingering scent of lavender, and I can still feel the weight of those eyes watching us from the shadows. We went there looking for peace and a break from the world, but we found something much older and much darker, and we were lucky to escape with our sanity intact. There are places in this world where you can feel the veil between the living and the dead wearing thin, and I promise you, St. Elmo is one of them. For Story Terlingua, Texas. We pulled our SUV into the dusty, sun-scorched outskirts of Terlingua, Texas, and the vast, hollow silence of the desert seemed to swallow our arrival whole. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat for our family of four, myself, my wife, and our 2 teenage children, along with our little tabby cat, Luna, whom we had brought along for the adventure. As the crumbling, old mining structures appeared on the horizon, the air felt thin and dry, vibrating with a strange, static energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I opened the back door to let Luna out, expecting her to stretch and explore, but she didn't budge. Instead, she arched her back, hissed at the empty, desolate landscape, and dug her claws into the upholstery of her carrier, refusing to take a single step toward the house we had rented for the week. I tried to pick her up, but she yowled in genuine, desperate terror, scrambling back deep into the shadows of the car, her pupils dilated until her eyes were nothing but black pools of fear. My kids laughed it off, but I felt a sudden, sharp coldness wash over me, a feeling of being unwelcome that was so intense it made my chest ache. We walked toward the house, our footsteps crunching loudly on the parched ground, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the silence inside felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on our shoulders. The cabin smelled of stale dust, ancient stone, and something sharper, like copper, that lingered in the back of my throat. My wife whispered that she felt like we were being watched, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't find a single logical reason to tell her she was wrong. That first night, the darkness in Terlingua was absolute, a thick, ink-black void that seemed to swallow the light from our lanterns. Around midnight, the house began to talk back, not in the sound of settling wood, but in rhythmic, deliberate thumps that sounded like someone walking in heavy boots across the roof. My kids huddled together in the living room, their eyes wide as they pointed toward the hallway, where a shadow seemed to detach itself from the wall and glide silently toward the kitchen. It wasn't just a trick of the light, the air around us dropped 20 degrees in seconds, turning our breath into icy mist, and the sound of a woman's soft, mournful humming began to drift through the house, growing louder and more insistent with every passing heartbeat. I tried to be the protector, the one who kept things rational, but my own resolve shattered when I walked into the kitchen to find the cupboard doors wide open and a stack of old, rusted mining tools piled neatly in the center of the floor. There was no one else in the house, yet the dust on the floor was disturbed by heavy, dragging footprints that led from the wall directly to where I stood. I felt a cold, unseen hand brush against the back of my neck, a touch so light and yet so terrifying that I gasped and stumbled backward. My wife grabbed my arm, her face drained of all color, and whispered that she could see faces, dozens of them, pressed against the window glass, their expressions twisted in eternal, silent agony. We realized then that we weren't just in a house, we were in a graveyard of memories, and the things that had lived and died in this desert were still tethered to the very walls around us. I ran back to the car to check on Luna, and I found her shivering uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the house with an expression of pure, unbridled horror. She wouldn't let me touch her, she just kept staring at the bedroom window where a faint, sickly glow was beginning to pulse. The humming grew into a piercing, discordant shriek that vibrated through the floorboards, and the entire house shuddered as if it were being torn apart by a sudden, violent earthquake. We didn't stop to think, we scrambled into the car, shoved Luna into her carrier, and I hit the gas with such force that we left a cloud of dust billowing in our wake. I drove for hours, not speaking, not looking back, while my kids sat in the back seat in total, shivering silence. Even miles away, out on the open highway where the world felt sane again, I could still feel the weight of those eyes from the windows and hear that mournful humming echoing in the back of my mind. We never went back for our things, and I never told anyone exactly what we saw in those final minutes, because some experiences are too heavy to carry back into the normal world. That place Interlingua isn't just an abandoned town, it's a living, breathing testament to the darkness that hides in the corners of the world, and I know, as surely as I breathe, that whatever we left behind is still waiting in that heat, watching the horizon for the next set of visitors to wander too close to its door. 5-story Thurmond, West Virginia. We pulled our dusty truck to a stop in front of the old, weathered station house in Thurmond, West Virginia, and the silence of the valley was so absolute it felt like it was pressing against our eardrums. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat for our family of 3, myself, my wife, and our teenage daughter, and we had brought along our small, jittery rescue rabbit, Snowy, who usually traveled everywhere in his carrier. As I stepped out of the truck, the air felt cold and damp, smelling of wet iron and rotting wood, an oppressive scent that clung to the back of my throat. I reached into the back seat to grab Snowy's travel cage, but the moment I lifted it near the porch of the station, the poor animal began to thump his back legs violently, throwing himself against the wire mesh in a frenzy of pure, unadulterated panic. He wouldn't look toward the building, he kept his ears pinned flat against his head, his nose twitching in rapid, terrified bursts, as if he could smell a predator that my own human eyes couldn't perceive. I tried to tell myself he was just stressed by the mountain air, so I walked toward the front door, feeling the dry, brittle grass snap under my boots. My wife and daughter followed, but the closer we got to the entrance, the more the atmosphere shifted, the air became heavy, static-charged, and remarkably cold. As I pushed the heavy oak door open, a long, low groan echoed from deep within the structure, not the sound of settling foundations, but a deliberate, mourning sound that vibrated right through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. My daughter stopped dead in the entryway, her face turning pale as she grabbed my hand, whispering that someone was standing at the top of the grand staircase, just watching us with a gaze that felt like a needle pressed against her skin. We spent the first few hours trying to unpack, but the energy in that house was hostile, buzzing with a restlessness that made it impossible to stand still. Every time I turned my back, I felt like I was being followed, a sensation of cold breath on my neck that sent shivers racing down my spine. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the dense, suffocating canopy of the West Virginia trees, the house started to wake up. I was in the kitchen, trying to get some water, when I heard the distinct sound of a telegraph machine clicking away in the study, a fast, frantic code that shouldn't have been possible in a building that hadn't seen electricity or service for decades. I walked into the study, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the room was empty, save for the thick layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The clicking sound stopped the second I crossed the threshold, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the slow, rhythmic tapping of a cane against the hardwood floor. My wife came running into the room, her eyes wide with fear, and whispered that she had seen a shadow dart across the upstairs balcony, a tall, hunched figure in a conductor's uniform that seemed to blur at the edges, as if it weren't fully tethered to this reality. We rushed to check on Snowy, who had been left in the carrier in the living room, but he was huddled in the farthest corner of the cage, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He wouldn't move, wouldn't eat, and kept staring at the corner of the ceiling with such intense, fixated dread that I felt my own skin crawl, realizing he was seeing something that we were only partially sensing. As night fully took hold, the house became a prison. The hallway lights, which were strictly off, began to flicker with a faint, ghostly illumination, and the sound of heavy, iron-wheeled carts grinding against the floorboards roared from the basement, though we knew there was nothing down there but shadows. My daughter started screaming, claiming that the conductor was walking right through the walls, his eyes glowing with a cold, hollow light that drained the warmth from the air. The temperature in the house dropped so severely that our breath formed thick, white clouds in the darkness, and the smell of ozone and wet coal became so strong it was almost suffocating. We were trapped in a loop of history, a place where the tragedy of the past was still playing out, and we were nothing more than unwanted spectators in a nightmare that wouldn't end. We didn't bother packing, we grabbed the essentials, scooped up the terrified rabbit, and bolted for the front door, our legs feeling like lead as the shadows seemed to lengthen and reach for us like grasping fingers. The door wouldn't open at first, the handle jammed as if held by an invisible force, and I had to throw my entire body weight against it to break the seal. We scrambled into the truck, and I didn't stop to look back until we were miles away, the dark silhouette of Thurmond fading into the rearview mirror like a bad dream. Even now, whenever I think about that station, I can still hear the rhythmic tapping of that cane and the phantom clicking of the telegraph machine, calling out to anyone foolish enough to stop by. We left behind more than just our belongings, we left a piece of our peace of mind, knowing that some places are just too haunted to ever truly be reclaimed by the living.